Can you hear me? Can I be heard here in English?
Yes, good evening. Yes, perfectly audible, sir. Namaskar,
thank you very
welcome.
much. Good morning, or good evening in India, sorry.
We are very happy to be with us, sir.
I'm very happy to be here with you.
Thank you. So we'll be starting sharp at 5, sir.
David, hello there.
Hello. Oh, good to
Hello,
see you, Sean. Yeah, I saw you were on the other keynote speaker. How are you?
Good. It's 8:30 here in Japan.
You're in Japan?
Yes. Bonnie, Japan.
This is a really international gathering then, this, isn't it? 'Cause I'm sitting here in East Anglia in England. He's in Japan. You're in Bihar. Great to be here with everybody.
Super international. Professor, I think my name is actually Sean. You just said Cian now. You know, like James Bond, Sean Connery.
Sean Michael Wilson.
Yes. And also,
okay,
I'm unlucky enough not to be English. I'm Scottish.
Okay.
Actually.
Okay,
as
sir,
Orwell kind of was also.
Thank you for correcting, sir.
And I know my professional name is DJ Taylor, but please call me David, which is how I go with everybody. So it's David for purposes of communication and questions in this.
Okay. David, thank you for writing the quote, which is on the back of our graphic novel.
It was a great pleasure. It was a really interesting production. There are going to be some more, are there, I believe?
Well, as I said to you in the email the last time, if dear old capitalism will allow us.
Well, I very much hope that it does. No, it was a good... it was very planned, very well executed as well.
Yeah, I think we did a good job on it. As you know, as a writer yourself, you can never tell when you go into the forest of a new book.
Absolutely.
What's going to happen there?
You may never come out the other side. Occupational hazard of the profession.
Yes, indeed. But what I would like to do, and I think I mentioned this in the talk, is I'd like to do 2 more if sales will allow. I mean, of course, Pluto is a very left-wing publisher, but they also need to sell things too, unfortunately. So I'd like to do one on Orwell's colonial experiences, which of course is very connected to today.
Indeed.
And I'd like to do one on his tramping experiences around mainly England, of course.
Well, that's good. As with the prep school one, they're both extremely formative influences. I think, you know, in terms of actually working out what made him tick and the motors that drove him. I think they're very important. So that's good.
I agree. Well, that's what I'd like to do if sales allow. So we'll see later this year how it's selling. And
good.
Respected Dean, sir.
Yes, Dr. Omkar, you can start the program now.
Yes. Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you. A pleasant good evening, good morning to one and all. Thank you for being here this evening with us virtually. Department of Educational Studies, School of Education, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, Champaran, Bihar, India, welcomes to each one of you to commemorate the literary legacy of George Orwell. I place my sincere gratitude to Honorable Vice Chancellor, Honorable Pro Vice Chancellor in absentia for their kind inspiration, and also respected Dean for constant motivation and inspiration to organize and take the activities of the department and entire team of School of Education. It has been 71 years since George Orwell left this world physically on 21st January 1950. However, George Orwell remained alive and relevant even today through his novels and essays. His thought-provoking ideas and magnificent contribution left a great impression on millions of readers, including me. Today, on his death anniversary, Department of Educational Studies, School of Education, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, Champaran, Bihar, India, organizes an international webinar on democratic spirit and George Orwell. George Orwell contributed enormously to the field of literature as a prolific author, journalist, advocate, and promoter of ideas on justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Today, we are blessed and fortunate enough to have two prolific authors and writers from England and Scotland, D.J. Taylor, a prolific writer from England, and Sean Michael Wilson, a geographical novelist from Scotland. With this, and also we have with us trustee of George Orwell Society, Chair Quentin Cobb, United Kingdom. So with this brief introduction, today I welcome each one of you with all humbleness and pranam from India for this virtual evening. So on this brief note, I invite Professor Ashish Srivastava, respected Dean, School of Education, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, Champaran, for introducing and welcoming the guest of the day. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Omkar, for this opportunity. At the outset, let me congratulate Astik Mishra and his team, having seniors and juniors, for putting their heart and soul to get this event organized successfully. I always believe that it is a student who takes the institution to the newer heights. I'm happy that all students, scholars of the Department of Educational Studies, School of Education, have understood the essence and in turn making all efforts squarely. Getting an international event organized is not at all an easy task. It needs planning, dedication, devotion, and several efforts. I'm happy to see all at one platform. I'm also very happy that the birthplace of George Orwell is seeking attention rapidly among younger generation. Today, we are paying our tribute to the legendary George Orwell on his 71st death anniversary by organizing this international webinar. Needless to mention the role of leadership in creating all such motivation. We are blessed to have an immense source of motivation, encouragement, support, and a great combination of academic and administrative skills. He is none other than our beloved Vice Chancellor, Professor Sanjeev Kumar Sharma, sir. I welcome him in his absentia. He will be joining us shortly. We are blessed to have a powerhouse of experience and ideas in the form of our beloved Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor G. Gopal Reddy, sir. We all know that he is suffering. He has been tested positive and he is taking rest. In absentia, I welcome him too. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome two great legendaries, Shri David Taylor ji and Shri Sean Michael Wilson ji. I am thoroughly touched by their humility. For the larger benefit of the audience, let me try to share about our both the key speakers, their credentials, our understanding, and truly vast. Let me take this opportunity to introduce Shri Sean Michael Wilson ji. Sean Michael Wilson ji is a graphic novel writer, is an also award-winning comic book writer from Scotland, who now lives in Japan. His book, With the War on Want, Iraq Operation Corporate Takeover, was widely reported. He is also the editor of the critically acclaimed collection, AX Alternative Manga, one of the publisher's weekly best 10 books in 2010. He was the lead writer for Fight the Power and Goodbye God. Let me quote Publishers Weekly, which says, Sean Michael Wilson is a comic book renaissance man. Let me also quote Paul Bolle, who says, a talented, notable in the fast emerging world of the non-fiction graphic novel with a handful of awards and some 20 graphic novel to his credit, sharing the complete persona and contribution of Sean Michael Wilson for a little intelligent person like me is very difficult. I am truly grateful to you, sir, for being with us. Welcome, sir. Now, let me take this opportunity to introduce another legendary personality, Shri David J. Taylor ji. David Taylor was born in 1960, studied at St. John's College, Oxford, and is a writer and critic. He is having plenty of collection of his vast writings to his remarkable credit. Let me share few. His collection of short stories After Bathing at Baxter's was published in 1997. He is also the author of several novels, including Great Eastern Land, Real Life, English Settlement, Trespass, a satire of 1970s England, The Comedy Man, Kept, The Victorian, Mystery, and Ask Elise. Several of his books are set in his home city of Norwich. His books of non-fiction include After the War, the novel, and England since 1945, When Conceit, British Fiction in the 1980s, a critical look at the quality of non-fiction writing in Britain, and most recently, Bright Young People, The Rise and Fall of a Generation. He's also well known for his biographies, Thackeray and Orwell. The Life, published in 2003, coincided with the centenary of Orwell's birth. This book won 2003 with Bread Biography Award. David Taylor is also a critic and reviewer, and his journalism appears in a number of newspapers and magazines, including The Independent on Sunday, and The Guardian. His latest books include further novels. Let me quote few: At the Chimney of a City Clock, Derby Day, Second Hand Daylight, The Winster Faction. The list of his contributions is too long. I have no words to express my gratitude that you have not only accepted our invitation, but also motivated, inspired the young scholar like Astik Mishra. Having you here is our honor, sir. I welcome you, sir. Welcome to this forum. Let this COVID pandemic situation be over. We would love to host both of you here in person at Motihari, the birthplace of George Orwell. I have been told.
Thank you.
Welcome, sir. I have been
Tani word
sure.
in Hindi.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So nice of you, sir. I have been told that Quentin Kopp is also with us today. I welcome you, sir.
Oh.
A few weeks back only, I was told about you by Sri Richard Blairji in one of our informal communication. I wish if you can visit Motihari along with Sri Richard Blairji. I welcome you once again, sir. I welcome all my learned colleagues from within and outside Mahatma Gandhi Central University. I welcome everyone present here. There is a small request to both the key speakers today. You are going to share among non-English speaking audience who are good at understanding and speaking both, but in Indian accent at large. It will be great if both of you can keep your speed little slow while speaking for better understanding in general. Okay. I welcome each one of you. I wish the program a great success. I again congratulate Astik Mishra and entire team of Angad Singh, Ganesh Shukla, Patlo Tomkar ji, Manisha Rani ji, Rashmi Srivastav ji, my colleague Dr. Mukesh Kumar ji, and all my students, all my scholars. Because time is less, therefore I'm not taking all the names. I wish the program a good success. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you one and all. Over to Dr. Patlo Tomkar ji.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your constant motivation, engagement, and being a strong influential leader to us as a department, leading department. you, sir. Thank you very much for your kind introduction to the both of the prominent writers today with us, having with us. Thank you. Now I would like to invite Astik Mishra, the man behind this program, the scholar who has been tirelessly working to organize program, this international webinar today. So I request Mr. Astik for introducing the theme of the program for today's international webinar. Mr. Astik Mishra, over to you.
Thank you so much, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yes,
Thank
you
you.
are audible.
So before discussing about the theme of the webinar, I would just like to talk a few things about my connection with George Orwell. So I just want to share a little story when I came to know about George Orwell. So when I was a kid, I was almost in class 2 or 3. BBC sent his team from England to India, to especially in Motihari in 2002, to locate the place where George Orwell was born. And during that time, the whole magazine and the newspaper was full of George Orwell and his literary work. So I was very small kid and reading all those newspapers who was George Orwell and how he contributed in all, especially in political atmosphere, and his writings were so much influential. So it's just a kind of a destiny that I have done my MPhil dissertation on George Orwell, and I feel very much connected that from that time to now. And now I know a lot of things, but still I have to know many more things about Orwell. So, and talking about the theme of the webinar, that is democratic spirit and George Orwell. So we all know that George Orwell was a kind of a writer who mostly write about the political atmosphere of his time. And he mostly write about those things which he really lived in. What was interesting about George Orwell, that even though George Orwell never... when he was 1 year old, his mother, Ida Mabelbeer, took him back to England. But even though he never came back to India, yet his writings were very much influenced by India, because he spent almost 5 years in Burma. And during that time, he met, I think, many Indian, and he was very much aware of the Indian culture. Like, for example, when he was writing a hanging, he was the person who was going to be hanged. He was chanting Ram and Ram and Ram. And when he was writing an essay like Reflections on Gandhi, he was especially using the term Satyagraha. And also in Dr. Veeraswamy in Burmese days. So all of these characters were Indians. So I feel very much connected that even though in his time, Orwell was very much aware of our culture and our society, and all of those colonial power and imperialism have influenced him so much. And talking about the theme, that is democratic spirit, the kind of writings Orwell produces was that he wants that a society should be equitable. When he was writing Animal Farm, he was quoting that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than the other. So we can draw from those lines that he wants a society where it should be equality should be in practice, and there should be a justice and racial discrimination, all those things which he had inferred from Burmese days or Animal Farm, or the dangers of totalitarian society, which he mentioned in 1984. So all of these things somehow indicate that, and also while he was writing Why I Write, he especially mentioned the line, I was all against imperialism and up for democratic socialism. All of these things indicate that Orwell was not, I can't say 100% surely, but I can say that his spirit was very much inclined towards the democratic spirit. So now I feel very honored to listen to both the speakers, and I don't want to say many more things about Orwell, because I am just in a learning phase. And David Taylor's books, the Orwell, The Life, and I have also come to know that he is also again going to write about Orwell, and maybe in few years he will produce some books about Orwell. And Sean Michael, I have attended his webinar where Richard Blair was also there. So I just feel very honored and lucky enough to be part of this event. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Asti. Thank you very much for your significant contribution on the George Orwell in the Department of Educational Studies, School of Education, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, and also your significant work on this George Orwell. So thank you very much, Astik, for introducing the democratic spirit and George Orwell. With this, today we are honored and it is blessed to have Sean Michael Wilson from Scotland, and the one who lives in Japan now is a graphical novelist. And so with all humility and gratitude, I request to you, Mr. Sean Michael Wilson G, for your kind presentation and interaction with all our today. Thank you. Thank you. Over to Sean Michael Wilson. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You can all hear me okay? Let me start by telling you something about Scotland and India, which maybe I presume none of you know, but I learned a few words of Hindi, just a few words, unfortunately, but one of them is Bariya. And Bariya means good, right?
Good.
Okay, good. Now, well, let me tell you an interesting thing, which David also probably doesn't know. In Scotland, in the east coast of Scotland, where I'm from, we say Bari to mean good. Now, that's, David, did you know that?
I did. I knew that.
Oh, he's a clever lad. So we say Bari, and that seems like an amazing coincidence, but then I researched it a little bit and I saw it's not a coincidence, because it came from the, as we used to call them, gypsies, the Romani people from India took the word, and eventually, of course, it ended up, the last place it must have gone to must have been Scotland. So that word Bari, yeah, has become over how many thousand miles is that? 3,000 miles, and hundreds of years from India to Scotland. So when I was a little boy, we used to say Bari, as meaning good. Now, so you know about me a little bit, and let me go into my website if I can remember how to share that and tell you a little bit more about me. Hopefully my website's there now. Can you see my website?
Yes, sir, you can see.
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
So,
yes, sir.
As it says, I'm from Scotland, not England. And I'm going to mention something about Orwell and Scotland and England later. But let me just quickly show you about what I do. The professor was kind enough to read out these quotes about me before. I am a graphic novel or comic book writer, which is a type of writing which was very much misunderstood before, but which is thankfully rather appreciated in the world now, which is a nice thing for people like me. And I do comic books which are they're not children's comic books. I have nothing against children's comic books. That's an art form in itself, but the comic books I do are for adult readers. And you can see the George Orwell one here. I live in Japan, so many of my books are about Japan. This one's about the spirit of Japan. This one is about the Minamata Disease, which is a real tragedy which happened in this part of Japan which I live in, which is the southwest of Japan, a little bit under Nagasaki where the bomb was. And I've done lots of different books. I've actually done, amazingly enough, I've done 44 books, which is incredible. I can't believe it myself, on various different themes. This one's about Japanese ghost stories. You can see this one's in Japanese. That says Tokyo Olympic. But I also do books on history, on British history and social issues. This one was with the General Federation of Trade Unions, which is a trade union kind of umbrella for the whole of the UK. And we did this for 120 years of their activities, supporting and celebrating their activities. This one, The Many, Not the Few, is about an even longer period of time, 700 to 800 years since the Peasants' Revolt in the south east of England. and goes right up to the present day. And it's a history of people's protest movements, popular protest movements in the UK in general. And it had an introduction by the previous leader of the Labour Party, and actually had a launch party in the House of Commons in London, which is an amazing thing. But let me jump to our Orwell book and show you some details about it. Now, the theme, of course, the theme today is the democratic spirit of George Orwell, and I'm going to give some of my views about that. David knows far more about Orwell than I do, but my interest in Orwell is very, very considerable. I deeply love Orwell's writing now, especially his shorter pieces rather than the main novels. And one of the things which the Orwell Society, including Quentin, who you just said is here, mentioned to me is that they want to focus on the idea that Orwell wrote more than 2 books. Of course, 1984 and Animal Farm are very, very important books, but it's good to focus on the other things which Orwell has written. And so this was the book which we chose to focus. Actually, it's not a book, it's just a short autobiographical story or sketch by George Orwell himself. Such were the joys. And it's about his childhood experiences in the kind of middle school, if you like, from when was it, 1911 to 1916. So it's more than 100 years previous. And the title is a rather ironic title because there's not too many joys in the book. For the main part, Orwell is complaining about various negative experiences which he had in his school years. Let me show you some pages and tell you a little bit about how we make this. So, as David knows, and anyone who's written any kind of creative work will know, one of the things that we need to do as writers is to weave various complicated things together into a thread in some way which is coherent. And what I do as a graphic novel writer is I work with artists, which means that I do not do the whole book myself. That's important to make clear. I write it and I work with artists. Now, the question is, how do you do that? Everybody knows about comic books. It's an international art form, but very few people know how they are made. So I want to also say a little bit about how we make these comic books as well. In terms of putting these complicated ideas together, because my books are normally about history and biography and social issues, normally they are rather complicated topics. So what we try to do is to make it more accessible via the visual format. Because the thing about the visual format of comic books is that according to various studies that have been done at various universities in the world, the best way for us to take in information is a mix of text and art. That's how we take it in easier, we process it easier, and we can recall it better, according to these various studies, if they're correct. And that's one of the reasons that I use comic books as an art form, because I believe that's the case, that it's a good way to take in complicated information. And as we all know now, unfortunately, many young people are not keen or not so keen on reading. And one of the advantages of a comic book is if you hand like a young person a 200-page textbook and a 200-page comic book, generally they will think the comic book is an easy read. So it doesn't put them off reading. Whereas, of course, I totally disagree with this habit. It's very, very bad, but it appears to be a common habit amongst young people that they're put off reading text books, text-only books. So comic books can overcome that kind of psychological barrier which young people have to reading. But if it's a well-made comic book, the textual level of sophistication can be just as high. The only difference really fundamentally between comic books, or graphic novels as we call them nowadays, and textbooks is there's more words on each page. I mean, of course, that's a very fundamental difference. But essentially, a comic book can be at any level of sophistication. So what we try to do is take these ideas or these people or these events from history and make them accessible, but as much as we can, accurate and sophisticated to the actual people that we are looking at, or the times or the issues that we're looking at. Now, what we've done with Orwell is we've created various things to tie it all together. Now, in this case, it was, I would say, not so difficult, actually, because Orwell's story, Such for the Joys, is written in a more or less chronological way, not exactly, but more or less, and is very visual and a very interesting read already. So there wasn't, in some ways, all that much for us to do in this case. In other cases, for example, I've done a visual adaptation of Wuthering Heights, which is over there behind me. And Wuthering Heights is a very long, very complicated book. And to adapt that into a much shorter novel was quite difficult. In the case of Orwell's book, not so difficult. Now, but we've created various things which we hope fit into the general book and are accurate, or things that Orwell would actually have done or thought. So this beginning scene is something which may or may not have happened, but it's a realistic possibility of Orwell going through Eastbourne in 1939 or maybe 1940. And Eastbourne is where the school was, St. Cyprian's, that he went to. And so what we've done is created this. This is totally fictional, but we imagine realistic, possibly. And he thinks about going in there, but decides not. Meaning getting off in Eastbourne and going to visit his old school. But he decides not to. And instead, after the train leaves Eastbourne, he starts to write this account of his childhood. Of course, this is entirely fictional, but relatively realistic as to a way to introduce the story. And the end of the story also takes us back to Orwell leaving on the train. Now, from this page onwards, it goes into Orwell's actual words. So here we have St. Cyprian's School. I say preparatory is kind of a middle type school in 1911. Eastbourne is in the south of England, on the coast. And what we see here is the kind of words which most of them are taken directly from Orwell's text. Because as I said, in this particular case, we didn't have to change it hugely. The book which I've just finished now is Tale of Genji, which is supposedly the first ever novel in the world, although that's debatable. But it was written 1,000 years ago here in Japan. And for that, it's a hugely long book. So we had to change a lot of it. But in this case, not so much. Now, let me nip down and show you how it starts. Now, if you look at this scene here, you can see this is the young Orwell, and this is his school mistress. And they called her Flip. Now, underneath here is the script for this. So what happens is when we're writing these comic books, when we're making them, we start with a script which looks a little bit like a film script, but slightly different. Comic books is, as I said, a much misunderstood art form and type of writing, but I think it's a very interesting and sophisticated form of writing. So it has its own grammar, it has its own techniques. So if we look at this, for example, panel 3, we see close to Flip herself standing up, all her body from a low angle looking up, so she appears menacing. And that's that. So what happens is, as a writer, as a comic book writer, you might say, write the art. I do not draw it, but I write the art. And what we see on the final page comes from my script, which is a guideline to the artist. But if you look closely from what I described in panel 3, this is not here. This little insert, as we call it, which is Orwell himself. Now, the artist has added that where it is not written specifically in my script, right? In this specific thing, in this part anyway. So the point of these comic books is when the writer and the artist work together, they do so in a collaboration of equals. And in a way, that is connected to our theme of democratic spirit. These books are created in a democratic spirit in which the artist and the writer respect each other, respect each other's views, and that starts from the very script aspect. We can see here, panel 4, young George. I called him Orwell and Georgia rather than Eric and Blair, looking up at her with fear and anxiety. So you can see the artist Jamie, has added that in here in a way which I have not quite described to him. And that's good, that's fine. This is an example of the democratic spirit which these books are written in between me and the artist when we work together. And unless what the artist does is really wrong, I'm happy with these kind of small changes because it's a collaboration of equals, and the end product is what I have thought and what the artist has thought and how we work together on it. Now you can see the dialogue is there. So we've got essentially 3 things: the description of the visuals, caption text, and dialogue text. And you can see it's all there. Here is the little boy who wets his bed every night, and it's there. And the captions are there. On this occasion, she was with the lady visitor. So it's all there in the script, and the artist takes my script as a kind of guide in the same way that films are made based on scripts, and directors and actors bring them alive. So let me show you some more details. Oh, you can just see on the top here that there's a little photograph which is actually from the school, because I often research these things quite well myself. So that's the dining hall, and you can see that it's there too in the art. So as in the scripts, there's very often visual research from myself to the artist. Now, let me show you some bits and bobs here. Oh, this is the talk that we had before in the Orwell Society, which was very enjoyable. And that's Jamie, the artist himself. Now, there's various things that we wanted to put in, and a few things that we took out. Now, in order to make things flow well together in a visual format, we need to change things a little bit. Translation and adaptation is just as much about what you leave out as what you put in. And the same with David's book about Orwell and the other books which David writes on real people. It's a question of deciding what you're going to put in and what you're not going to put in, and then how you're going to put it in and how you're going to connect it all together. So the basic thing that if we're doing a visual version is what elements are we going to show in text and what elements are we going to show visually? Because some of the things which Orwell himself wrote in text, we have chosen to show visually. So the feeling here is of a young child feeling lost and uncertain and put upon by these strong authority figures, which of course is rather undemocratic. And that's partly what Orwell talked about in his experiences in school about how undemocratic and how unfair they were. So rather than show that in text, we've decided to show that in visuals. And what happens in this particular scene is that Orwell, through his stress of being taken out of his home, where he appeared to be happy, and put into this boarding school where he had to stay there every day and live there and stay there the night. His stress manifested itself by wetting the bed, meaning he urinated in his sleep unconsciously. And in this scene, you can see this is the urine coming up and overwhelming him to express the idea which Orwell tells us about in this story of him feeling overwhelmed that this thing would happen unconsciously and he had no control over it. And he would be punished by his teachers, including physically punished. So this was a time in the UK where physical punishment was still acceptable in schools, or was allowed anyway, where children were actually hit by being caned. There's another example of the text. Flip, off panel. That's the kind of technical word where you don't see her. This is off panel here. What did you say? It's all written there. Come here this instant. Now, let me show you some of the details. This is Orwell sneaking down at night time to try and get some food because the food was so sparse there. I mean, they were given so little food that they had to kind of sneak down and get some more food at night time. Here's another example of us taking something which Orwell has written and showing it visually instead. In this case, in a way which is not realistic. These are exaggerated caricatures. In this case, showing how the child is helpless as a snake before a snake charmer. And in this case, the child is taking a kind of snake-type shape. And in here, this is very cartoonish. When we're making these comic books, we can have a decision to make the art realistic or cartoonish or abstract. And each of these should make a point and fit with the text and fit with the overall aim of the book. And in this case, we decided to play with what is normally rather realistic art, such as that, into exaggerated art and cartoony art. And again, this is taking the teacher, the female teacher, Flip, the headmistress, and exaggerating her into a kind of mythical monster, which is what Orwell describes in his text. And then also showing that she can be very nice and charming sometimes. Now, this page here is a good example of how graphic novels can add something to original stories or biography or real things which happened in a way which text books cannot do. Which doesn't mean I have anything against textbooks. Of course, I love reading text-only books as well. In this scene, Orwell is describing the type of education which happened then, which, again, this is connected directly to the topic of today, a democratic spirit in your educational department, which is that the children were just taught to learn things without thinking deeply what it actually means. So they were asked questions like, who plundered the Begums? Who was beheaded in an open boat? And they're supposed to answer, just give the answer, the Duke of Suffolk, 1415. This relates to India, actually. In colonial India in 1778. But what I thought we'd do is actually visualize the scenes which the boys were supposed to just come out with without really thinking what it meant, without understanding what it meant. And in these kind of scenes, Orwell is criticizing the education system of Britain at the time. In that case, we should say England and Scotland, because the education system of England and Scotland has always been slightly different, and is even more different now. But the education system at the time, which was based upon just preparing for exams and getting into Eton and getting into Oxford, etc., rather than thinking deeply about what the information actually means, rather than developing the ability to analyze things for yourself, rather than developing the ability to think for yourself. And I think that's one of the essential ideas which comes across in the book, is that Orwell disagrees with that form of education, and it is in itself not democratic, because if we are going to have a democracy, one of the key things that we need to have is an ability to choose for ourselves, to govern ourselves and organize ourselves. So Orwell criticized this form of education as not teaching people how to think for themselves, not being able to think politically, not being able to make the right political choices, the right organizational choices for themselves and their country. So that is directly connected to the idea of George Orwell's democratic spirit. And this book of ours has that in it. Now, I am Scottish, as I said, and one of the things which rather concerned me about Orwell at that time is that he didn't seem to like Scotland very much. And one of the reasons was because in his school, the Flip that we saw earlier, the lady and her husband, often made Scotland out to be a kind of mythological, wonderful place, which they, people talk about Orientalism now. They seem to kind of think of Scotland as being exotic others at that time. And Orwell was annoyed by this, and so he kind of got a rather bad image of Scotland. And thankfully, of course, later on he lived in Scotland and his image of Scotland changed. Now, in this scene, we can see these rich, upper middle class English people talking about going up to Scotland, which was very common then, and even still now, and criticizing and laughing at the accent. It says, "Our gillies in Scotland really know how to get the grouse out, but can you understand their guttural accent? Oh, not a word of it. It's all dinny day that. Geese anare tatties." So this is a kind of form of, you can say, British colonialism, because if we talk about the British colonial time in India and its influence on India, we should take into account that the first colonial places of England were Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. And the influence of colonial power and the power of the English language, as we're speaking now, rather than Gaelic. My name, Sean, is Gaelic, actually. We can see a rather anti-democratic power coming through Orwell's focus on colonialism as well. And this also relates to the relationship of the countries in the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And as a Scottish person, one thing which rather annoys me is that it's still very common for people to call the UK just England, which I don't like, of course. Now, this is the last thing. There are some positive elements in it. Most of it you can see is Orwell criticizing elements of his own experience and society, British society at that time, and the education system. But there are some positive things in it. And this is one of the things. Orwell loved newts and frogs and toads, and he wrote about toads, and he wrote about animals in his articles for various magazines like Tribune in the 1930s, 1940s. And here we see a scene where he went off with his school friends to look for newts. And I also love newts, actually. I have 2 newts here with me in Japan. Now, I'll close this again and come back to you. So, can you see me again? Just to make some closing comments, because I think my time is until when? 25 past, yes? Or sorry, 25 past in Japan. 5 minutes to 6 in India, right?
Yes. Yes.
So, just to say a few more things. I'm in Japan, and one of the problems with Japan is I showed you some visuals there of Orwell criticizing the education, the type of education of that time. Now, that is quite often what people say about Japanese and South Korean education system now. That if you speak to a young Japanese person, they know very, very, very little history, extremely little. I asked them about that, why, and they say that the education system in Japan for history is really boring and doesn't teach them to really understand the issues. And when I heard that, I thought about Orwell saying this. I think Orwell would be very disappointed to know that more than 100 years later, a similar situation applies to Japan, and also I've been told South Korea. So this issue of what is the purpose of education and how do we do education? There's a saying in Britain, education, education, education. But it's also a question of how do we educate, of course. So if we're going to be democratic in the way we educate, it seems to me that we need to focus on teaching people how to analyze, how to think for themselves, because we need an ability to analyze and think for ourselves if we're going to be able to organize ourselves democratically at both the local level and the national and the international level. So I think that's one of the reasons our book is, although it's set 100 years ago, more, it's still relevant to today. And of course, not just for Japan and South Korea. In the UK, over the last 20, 30 years, there's been a tendency to so-called go back to basics. And part of that appears to be reducing funding for the humanities, reducing funding for the social sciences, etc., in a way which seems to me to be really focused on the idea of not teaching people how to analyze things, not developing critical thinking skills, but kind of some way going back to an older form of education. So, as I say, I think our book is still relevant to today, and what Orwell wrote there or talking about 100 years is still relevant today. Anything else I want to say? I think that's pretty much it for me, except one last point. David may mention more about this, but if we talk about a democratic spirit and democracy, then of course Orwell talked about himself being a democratic socialist. It's often said by conservatives and right-wing people that Orwell was actually right-wing, or was criticizing communism, was criticizing the Soviet Union, was criticizing socialism. And people like myself are at pains to say, well, he may have been criticizing Stalin, but that doesn't mean he was criticizing democratic socialism. And of course, Orwell specifically said that 1984 was not an attack on socialism, that he was, since 1936, 1937, when he was in Spanish Civil War, everything he'd written was focused on, one way or another, democratic socialism. So I think that Orwell, for me, just to finish on a personal note, Orwell was a kind of maverick person who tried to think for himself, a maverick creator who tried to not follow along the authoritarian Stalinist approach of the time, despite considerable pressure to do so from friends and publishers and other people on the left in Britain. But he chose as a kind of maverick approach to think for himself and to understand and to develop his own critical thinking skills. Even if he made mistakes, that's an entirely different matter if you make a mistake or not, but thinking critically. And he's an inspiration for me because of that. And I think we can call that his democratic spirit if we like. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sri Shan Michael Wilson ji, for such an thoughtful insights on your recent graphical adaptation of such the George Orwell. Not only you have brought in your interaction, in your deliberations, you have put all the dimensions of George Orwell on intellectual, religious, moral, and social, and ideas and sketches and script and sketches on George Orwell, how George Orwell, his native experiences of the George Orwell, why George Orwell was not so much joy in his childhood, what are the reasons, his complaints, nature complaints, and in a chronological way, you have elaborated in your book about George Orwell's journey, going to the East Bar and where he's getting in 1911 middle school, young Orwell going to his school and the tales, and you also brought the guidelines to the artist by creating the book on a democratic spirit, where George basically Eric Arthur Blair, his original name, and his pen name is George Orwell. So with this also, you also focus on translation and adaptation, the issues in relation to the translation and adaptation of the text, and how young Orwell, how we are going to connect George Orwell in recent time, and George Orwell feelings, how he feels sometimes with authoritarian nature, his stress, his loss, and he was quiet, and in his how he's figuring out from his childhood schools. And also you have focus on food, how little food was given to the Orwell, and Orwell was constantly questioning the authoritarians, and also how George Orwell childhood critically, he also examined the education system, where George Orwell was criticizing the information given in the school rather than he was focusing on ability to analyze and ability to think. That is where Orwell is more democratic, the forms of education when we see in a democratic spirit. And also you have brought some positive things from his childhood experiences, George Orwell engagement with her surroundings like fog, and also the you also focus on how history is taken put in the context of Japan and South Korea. And you also focus on not teaching people how to analyze the histories, how to analyze the art form. So then, and also you have focused on the 100 years of analysis, 100 years of George Orwell, and with this broad and chronological way, you have very systematically brought the things of Orwell to the relevant of the democratic spirit of the Orwell. So with this, with humility, with gratitude to you, on behalf of Department of Education.
That's a good summary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I forgot to say a very undemocratic point.
Thank you.
To ask people to buy the book, because we need to get good sales. Yes, thank you very much for your good summary.
Thank you. Thank you, Shan Michael Wilson ji. Now, without wasting time, I would like to be with humility. I will be inviting DJ Taylor, a writer and a critic from England, for his interaction and deliberation. Now, with all humbleness, I invite DJ Taylor ji. Over to you.
Thank you. Could I start by asking if
Sir,
everybody can
welcome.
hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yes,
Can
I
you hear?
can. I can.
Excellent.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes. Yes, tell
I
us, sir.
should
Yes.
say to begin that if my machine here in England starts playing up and it sounds as if my voice is going, I'll switch it off and come back. So if I disappear, it's not because I've left in outrage, it's because I'm going to return as soon as I possibly can. Could I begin by saying how very pleased I am to be invited to address you all? It's wonderful to think that on the anniversary of his birth, we should be celebrating his life in the celebration done by an institution almost at the place of his birth. This is a wonderful thing, which I think he would have been very grateful. Asik Mishra, to whom I'm very grateful for sorting this out, was talking at the beginning of the event, and it's interesting how often people who come to Orwell and his writing have a story to tell about how they came to it, and so you find with a great many Orwell fans that there is always something in that experience of picking up their first Orwell book, of reading their first Orwell essay, that stays with them for the rest of their lives. Now, my own introduction to Orwell in that respect is very interesting and indeed curious, because in England, certainly in Great Britain, I should say, to appease Sean Michael Wilson's sensibilities, in Britain, most people read Orwell as school children. And the book to which they're generally introduced at a very young age is Animal Farm, because, of course, the subtitle of Animal Farm is a fairy tale. And so it's thought just the kind of book that small children in Britain might like to read before, usually in their teens, they're then brought on to the slightly stronger meat of 1984. And although I was encouraged as a small child to read Animal Farm, in fact, the book of Orwell's that I read first was one of his really rather more obscure productions. It's his second novel, A Clergyman's Daughter, which I think even most Orwell scholars and fans would probably concede is not his most wonderful book. It's simply a string of episodes from his own life that he's managed to connect together into some sort of intelligible narrative. Now, I read this book, I suppose, at the age of 12 or 13. I found it on my mother's bookshelf at home. There weren't many books on that bookshelf, but fortunately, fortuitously, here was a copy of A Clergyman's Daughter. And a great fashionable word these days in literary criticism, which I'm sure some of you will know, a kind of cant word, is relatable. When you read a book, it has to be relatable to you and your experience of life. Now, A Clergyman's Daughter is about a young woman in her late 20s living in Suffolk in the 1930s. In other words, even when I read it as a child, many years before, and in a completely different environment from the life I was living at the time. But for some reason, that book spoke to me. It impressed me at the age of 12 or 13 in a way that no other book previously had. And interestingly, when I later read Orwell's essay on the American writer Henry Miller, of whom he was a great fan, I found some words of Orwell with cancer in the early 1930s. He said something like, it was as if it had been written for him alone. Although there were many copies of the book in circulation and a great many people had read it, as if Henry Miller had written a single copy of the book with the aim simply of giving it to Orwell. And that was how I felt when I first read Orwell's work. I thought to myself, here is somebody who was speaking to me, who is, if you like, shooting a bullet across time, which I managed to see, which is for me alone. And that feeling has stayed with me for about the last 45 years, to the effect that Orwell has always been my writer in that kind of proprietorial way, which of course is quite wrong. Orwell is everybody's writer, or rather he is anybody's writer, anybody who wishes to pay attention to him and, you know, derive wisdom from some of the things that he wants to say and communicate. What I want to do in the course of the next half hour is I suppose, to discuss. I was told by the organisers that this event is regarded largely as a kind of brainstorming session. It was described to me as a way in which we can punt some ideas about Orwell about that might then be useful to all kinds of readers and people thinking about him. So I suppose what I want to do in the most general way is to discuss how Orwell came by his ideas about the democratic spirit, about equality and freedom and liberty and all those abstract nouns by which he was so obsessively interested during his short life, and to see how he came by them and some of their implications, I suppose, for the world we inhabit today. But just to take up something that I think Astik Mishra was saying again in his introduction, we must also, I think, one of the constants in Orwell's life, in his life and his writings, is his great fondness and regard, and in some cases his nostalgia from the East, in which he'd spent so much of his formative life. There's a wonderful account when he was working for the BBC in London during the Second World War, when he worked on the Eastern services, conducting talks and arranging speakers. And he had a great many Indian colleagues who were then in London at the time who were working with him. And he said that one of the things that he loved about working at the BBC was hearing the high Indian voices talking across rooms, which he said made him feel that as if he looked out of the window, he would see palm trees rather than the streets of London. Such was the impression they conveyed of the world that he'd come from. And it's interesting because as Astik Mishra mentioned again in his extremely thoughtful introduction, I'm currently writing a second biography of Orwell, which I hope to finish by the end of this year, which is based on the very large amount of new material that is becoming available to Orwell scholars over the last few years. And one of the fascinations of some of the new letters that he wrote to friends in the 1930s that have become available is that he remarks that he said that if an Englishman, or rather a Briton, goes to the East, to India or to Burma, the thing that he never gets out of his system is the scenery. And in fact, Orwell remarked of Burmese days that really it was, although there are characters and there's a plot and there is a critique of British colonialism in the East, the book is really about the scenery of Burma. It's about the extraordinary effect that the landscapes of the East have on a Western consciousness. And I think the feeling of this never left Orwell. And in his work, he is always referring back or just gesturing or making little nods to the time that he spent there. And it's very interesting to speculate what would have happened to his political and his literary development if he'd managed to take the job that he was offered in the late 1930s, working for the Lucknow Pioneer in India. He was offered a job on the subcontinent in 1938, but in the end wasn't able to take it up because he had his first serious hemorrhage in 1938 and was taken away to spend time in a sanatorium. And so he never made it back to the East, which I think is a shame in the terms of his subsequent development. But let me talk about some of the influences to which he was subject as a child and as a young man, and the path, the quite complicated and tortuous path that led him to write those great works of the 1940s and to assume, the position. I suppose it would certainly be true to say that if you're considering some of the great personalities of English literature, then Orwell, in popular estimation, would be up there, certainly with Dickens and Shakespeare, I would have thought, certainly the most powerfully remembered British writer of the 20th century. And when one looks at his early life, born in 1903, soon came, as has been remarked, soon came back to England to live a very conventional life of an English man of his generation. Now, Orwell remarked with the characteristic precision that he brought to any kind of social arrangements that in terms of the British class system, he belonged to what he called was the lower upper middle class. Now, what he meant by that was that he regarded most of the expertise and most of the social armature he had with him was theoretical. By that, he meant that he belonged to the kind of family who was supposed to ride horses and dress for dinner and go hunting and shooting. But in fact, they didn't have enough money to do that. So the Blairs, his family, led this kind of theoretical upper middle class existence. And Orwell, although he was educated at Eton College, which is the most expensive and the most prestigious public school in England, he was only able to do this because he managed to win a scholarship. And so he was placed at a very early age. And in fact, Sean Michael Wilson's book about Such Were the Joys draws this out. He was placed in a situation where he was not exactly there on sufferance, but a lot of the people who were around him had more money than he did and had better prospects than he did. And so whereas many of the boys that he was at Eton with at the time of the Great War, 1914 to 18, although many of them then went on to Oxford and to very prestigious jobs in the law and the British civil service, Orwell himself ended up going to Burma to work for the Imperial Police Force as a very young man. So I suppose it could be said that most of his mature political views and his development as a writer and as a political thinker were going against the grain of his nature. Now, Sean Michael Wilson was earlier talking about the eternal debate that, or not eternal, but a debate that certainly goes on as to exactly which side of the political spectrum did Orwell stand. So you have those two great novels, Animal Farm and 1984, which are attacks on left-wing authoritarianism. And it's a number of politicians on the right are always claiming Orwell for their own. I mean, most interest groups, really, if they think about it, can find ways of claiming Orwell for their own. The fact remains that, on the one hand, Orwell was a democratic socialist. On the other hand, I think it is true to say that he was a conservative with a small c in almost everything except politics. And so many of his social and his views seem to have been forged in that crucible of his childhood and his early life. And so much of his later work is, I think, going against the grain of his own nature and his own development. And this starts, of course, at the age of 19, when he is taken off. Oh, he's not taken off. He goes on that long journey to Burma to serve in the Imperial Police Force as an enforcer of a colonial regime. And of course, this is at a time when what the British thought about the East was being drawn into ever sharper focus, not simply by the fact that the East had begun to resent the suzerainty of the British, but at exactly the time at which Orwell arrived in Burma. And indeed, these conversations and these debates are reflected in some of the conversations that take place in the club, in the colonial club in Kayaktada, the village in which Burmese Days is set. This was exactly the time when in Britain inquiries were taking place into the Amritsar massacre undertaken by Brigadier General Dyer. And it's very interesting how the conversations which are recorded in Burmese Days very accurately reflect some of the criticism that British colonialism was beginning to get, even in conservative circles in the United Kingdom at this time. So Orwell has gone to Burma, to a hotbed of reaction and conservatism and Toryism and colonialism as a very young man. It's often one of the many myths that I think is peddled sometimes about Orwell, that this going off 8,000 miles to the east to serve colonialism was a sort of exile, that here was this 19-year-old boy sent off to the outer reaches of the earth, to become a colonial policeman. But in fact, in terms of Orwell's upbringing, going to serve in the East was a perfectly logical thing. Orwell's father, Richard Blair, had been a colonial civil servant who'd spent most of his working life in India. His mother's family, the Limousins, had come from the East, where they were teak merchants and timber merchants and shipbuilders. When Orwell went to Burma, he had two. I think he had a grandmother and an aunt living there already. He wasn't being sent off into some sort of terrible exile at the end of the world. He was being sent to a place that was very close to his own family, very close to his own upbringing. And so what he thought about imperialism when he served under it between 1922 and 1927, when he came back to England, is very difficult to work out, because most of the evidence we have for it is retrospective. We only know, all that we are able to read about is Orwell's Orwell's much vaunted hostility to the imperial system that he writes about after he'd left. And one of the interesting things about the very few glimpses we have of him when he's in Burma is that most of the people he came across, imperial civil servants, people of his own age who knew him there, was that they thought that he seemed to be a perfectly conventional imperial policeman. It's sometimes said that he returned to Britain in 1927 because he was determined to throw over the shackles of imperialism, that he'd realized he was living a lie, that he was serving a colonial regime that he wished to rebel against. But in fact, Orwell came home from Burma on a medical certificate. He got dengue fever. He was seriously ill. And I think it's possible to say that his decision, that he'd not yet come to the conclusions he reached about what he thought it was like serving an imperial power in the East. And so I think, again, it's a question of Orwell is rebelling. I mean, he certainly saw himself as a rebel in those days. He was revolting against a system that he disliked and no longer served. But the problem with this, that as I say, he is going against the grain of his own sensibility. And so much of Orwell's writing, I think, almost to the end of his life, is this kind of psychological struggle between. It's the struggle of a man who believes in progress, who believes in democratic principles and values and egalitarianism and equality and all this kind of thing, and yet is so conscious of the debt he owes to the past, to the past that has forged him, and so much of his early life and his attempts to formulate a political position in the 1930s, I think, are based on this. The great question about Orwell's political development, when we look at the books that he wrote in the second part of his life, is when did he come about these principles? When can it be said that Orwell is the Orwell that we know, the Orwell of the 1940s, the Orwell who wrote columns for the left-wing weekly magazine Tribune, the Orwell who wrote Animal Farm in 1945 and 1984, just before his death in 1949. And I think it would be true to say, certainly looking at the things that he writes about, there are some newly discovered letters that have come up written to people in the 1930s, and he several times, there's a marvelous letter written in 1931. 1931, as many of you I'm sure will know, was a watershed in British politics. The economy had begun to collapse in the wake of the Wall Street crash of 1929. Britain had a national government. We'd gone off the gold standard, which was an event of huge symbolic significance, for the old Britain of the imperial days. And Orwell at this time was living in London. He'd just come back from the tramping expeditions that produced his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London. So he's living in London. He's actually staying half a mile away from the Bank of England, where all these decisions were being taken about how to restructure the country's economy in 1931. And at this time, he writes several letters to friends in which he restates the words, it's a terrible situation here, but I'm not very interested because I know nothing about and I'm not interested in politics. And this is George Orwell writing in 1931. So clearly the political sensibility he had later developed, the seeds of it had barely been sown. Similarly, when we look at what he was doing during the mid-1930s, there's his trip famously in 1936. He gave up his job in a bookshop in London and undertook a tour of the depressed industrial areas of the north of England, where there was great poverty, something as much as the third of the male adult population was unemployed. And Orwell went around the north of England examining these conditions to write The Road to Wigan Pier, which was published in 1937. And again, that book betrays very little political awareness. There are remarks about people who were members of the Labour Party or the Communist Party. And yet Orwell's attitude as he regards them is almost that of an anthropologist, somebody who has come upon a different tribe. He will describe someone as very active in the Labour Party. And it's clear that Orwell knows very little about this and is simply observing and is focusing on the things that interested him rather than the wider political picture. So I think it's true to say that the decisive shift in him, in his acquiring a political consciousness, came in the very last days of 1936, when he arrived in Barcelona as a volunteer to serve in the Spanish Civil War. And Orwell, there are several letters, and in fact, the book that he later wrote about Spain, Homage to Catalonia, makes this clear, that Orwell wandered around the Barcelona of January 1937 in a kind of state of wonder, because what had happened in that particular part of Spain was that a revolution from below, rather than one imposed from above, had utterly transformed the social atmosphere of the place. It was a place, if you tried to offer a tip to the lift man in a hotel, he would be angrily refused on the grounds that we were all equal and that he was doing his job and didn't need to be tipped. And Orwell, this didn't last a very long time. And when Orwell went back to Barcelona in May 1937, he realized that the atmosphere had changed and that the middle classes were sort of quietly back in control of things. But what he saw, as he said to his friend and literary sponsor, Cyril Connolly, he said, "I have seen wonders." And I think it was, as far as I can determine, it was the atmosphere of being in Barcelona, of being in Spain at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War that transformed him, that produced the kind of ballast, if you like, behind his later political views. But of course, there is a downside to this story, which was it was in Spain, as well as seeing a situation in which he thought that socialism could actually work and the democratic principles could be instilled. It was also in Spain that Orwell saw the worst of the organized left, because the constrictions, the conflicts of Spanish politics meant that by the middle of 1937, Russia had begun to exert much more of an influence over the way in which Spain was working. And it's true to say that Orwell, who'd made the mistake of serving for a small part of the Trotskyist militia, called the POM, Orwell ended up on a Soviet hit list and was very lucky to get out of Spain with his life, and later found himself denounced as a traitor to the cause. So it was in Spain too, as he said, that he first saw what we might call some of the media manipulations that are such a feature of 1984. I mean, he says somewhere in Homage to Catalonia that it was in Spain that he first saw newspaper reports of battles in the war that hadn't actually happened. It was when he read accounts of soldiers whom he knew had fought valiantly being denounced as cowards. And it was then he realized what an officious state bureaucracy with control of the media that was determined to rewrite the past. It was then that he saw what regimes of that sort can do. And I think that is what sowed some of the seeds of 1984. The interesting thing about Orwell, so Orwell, when he comes back from Spain, Orwell has become a very radical left-wing socialist. He joins the Independent Labour Party rather than the ordinary British Labour Party, because he thinks that is more likely to bring about the conditions of what he calls international socialism. Until the very beginning of the Second World War, he was very hostile to the idea of war. He thought it was a capitalist plot. He thought that he was a pacifist until the day of the Russian-German pact in August 1939. And the significant thing about his political views in the late 1930s, something that differentiated him, I think, from a large part of the orthodox British left, was that his political views were fundamentally built on anti-imperialism. He wrote a couple of essays in 1939 pointing out that in most sophisticated Western society, as he put it, most left-wing politics is hypocrisy, because the left refuses to acknowledge the fact that the standard of living that Western nations enjoyed in the 1930s and 40s was based on the exploitation of its colonies. And so he said his view was that if a left-wing politician was being serious in Britain in the 1930s, that person would have to admit that if we were going to have international solidarity and brotherhood, it would involve a reduction in the standard of living in the West, because it would mean paying the East a fair price for the commodities we were plundering from it. And this was a radical thing to be saying in the 1930s, but I think it underpins a lot of Orwell's views about international socialism in the 1940s. He then writes, Orwell had a very frustrating time largely during the Second World War, because he worked at the BBC, which although he enjoyed broadcasting to the East, and but he thought that he wondered a lot of the time just how many people were actually listening to what he said, and he was rather dispirited by the thought that the broadcast might be going out to India and Burma in the Far East, and they were in Malaya, and there wouldn't actually be any listeners. But he managed towards the end of the war to write to write Animal Farm, which of course is his great, like all his novels, and in fact like 1984 itself. It is a story, and all the realistic, the 4 novels that he wrote set in Britain in the 1930s all have exactly the same theme as Animal Farm, and indeed 1984. They're about revolutions that fail. They're about people who try to change the society of which they are part, but it doesn't work because there is some fatal flaw some way. And so in some ways, the heroes and the heroine of his 1930s novels are just the same as Winston Smith, and they're just the same as the poor animals in Animal Farm who seek to transform their lives, only to find that they've been traduced by people that they thought were their own allies. And one of the remarkable things, I think, one of the crucial things about Animal Farm's distinction is the way in which so many oppressed peoples here in the 21st century use it as a kind of spiritual carrying card. And so we saw a situation in Rhodesia where the president Mugabe was ridiculed by many local Zimbabweans who I believe who would hold up sort of symbols of will actually hold up copies of the book as he passed in the street because they thought that Mugabe was the head. Mugabe was the modern Zimbabwean equivalent of Napoleon. Beneath all this, so Orwell by this point has defined himself as a left-wing critic of the extreme level, rather than let us say that Orwell was a democratic critic of the non-democratic left. That's what he has become by the 1940s. But one of my interests, I think, in this strand in his thought lies in where that came from and the philosophical basis behind it, because I've talked before about Orwell's innate small c conservatism, and although Orwell didn't believe in God, he retained a profound attachment to the conventional Anglican religion of his upbringing, and so he's he, rather like Philip Larkin, rather like the British poet Philip Larkin, he regards a church as an eternal place, as something that is simply through its structures is a force for moral good and salubrity. And behind many times in the early 1940s, when he's discussing the nature of totalitarianism and totalitarian society, he makes the point that a lot of this is what he regards as displaced religious sensibility. In other words, the totalitarian believes that he can behave as he does because there is no divine justice anymore. If there's no afterlife, Orwell argues, you can do what you like because there's no thought of redress. And so a tyrant like Stalin behaves as he does in the thought that his own people can't stop him, but neither can any greater good either. So behind these two great satires of totalitarianism is the idea that a large parts of the Western world have dismissed what formerly used to be the belief in God, but have found nothing to replace it. And this has created an extraordinary vacuum in which all kind of authoritarians and tyrants can sort of wander about, persecuting people. The greatest expression of this, of course, is 1984. And I want to leave you, I suppose, with a thought as to what some of the implications of the world that Orwell created in 1984 might be today. Here we are, 73 years nearly since the book was published, a book that retains its relevance, a book, as was pointed out in the week that Donald Trump became president 5 years ago, sales of 1984 increased by 900% on the Amazon website, showing that people had clearly made some connection between that book and what was happening in American politics at the same time. But the world of 1984 is based, obviously, on a suppression of the democratic spirit, which is the title of this colloquium today. And that suppression had been imposed through autocratic means. In other words, dissent is suppressed. No newspaper in the world of 1984 is allowed to print the truth. The past that exists in those newspapers is doctored periodically by Winston Smith in his office, so that the truth, as propounded by Big Brother and his henchmen is always the truth, and 2 and 2 make 5, not because people pretend to believe in it, but because this is the true mark of totalitarianism. They actually believe that it is true. Now, there were many dystopian novels of the kind of 1984 written in the mid-20th century. One of them, in which Orwell took a particular interest and wrote about on several occasions, was Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And Orwell wrote a very interesting review of Huxley's Brave New World early in 1940. In fact, just at the point when Britain was threatened by invasion by Nazi Germany. But Orwell, that Sunday morning, was sitting down and writing one of his reviews, as he customarily did. He continued writing, he continued typing his stuff out all through the Brits, although he remarked several times that he thought it was completely futile and hopeless. And he wrote a review of Brave New World, where he said that he thought that Huxley had actually got it wrong, and that whereas Huxley's Brave New World envisages this world based on pure hedonism, where people simply spend all their time enjoying themselves in this kind of blissful, futuristic state. And Orwell says in his review that life isn't like that. People don't want that sort of thing, and an autocracy that was based on simply enjoying yourself and, if you like, kind of sedating people by offering themselves more pastimes and more leisure and more ways of enjoying themselves wouldn't last, because it would immediately become corrupted, and because people, the human spirit, as Orwell defined it, has something in it that wants more than that. According to Orwell, people are motivated by calls for blood, sweat and tears, and the mighty conflagrations of the world on which 1984 is predicated. And the thought I would like to leave you with, as I come to the end of this, is, was Orwell right about this? So Orwell maintains that Orwell's warning was that the world of the future might be like the world of 1984. Now, it could be said, as we look around, especially the Western world today, a Western world seduced by online entertainment, a world where teenagers spend large amounts of time playing video games, on which a lot of the world takes place in what the founders of Facebook now call the metaverse. And I sometimes wonder, looking at the way in which so much dissent and so much incipient rebellion is kind of stifled by the great weight of consumer materialism and internet technology that sits on it. I sometimes wonder whether, when it came to predicting the course of the future, I wonder whether Huxley is just as worthy of consideration as Orwell. And that's the thought I would like to leave you with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, DJ Taylor G. With this, thank you very much. You have elaborated.
I can't hear anybody, so I'm going to switch off and come back.
Okay.
Just wait for 1 minute. Okay, Omkar, go ahead.
Please be with us. Thank you very much, Sri DJ Taylor G, for good ideas of George Orwell. Initially, I have given this as a celebration, a wonderful celebration of death anniversary of George Orwell. And very interestingly, you have said in England, the practices of school and how in England, how the government of the schools in George Orwell animal farm at the school level, at the age of 12, how George Orwell influenced the criticism and the suffering of young women and tropical cancers of 1930. George will also mention that everybody can be a writer, as George Orwell what he want to say, and how Orwell came into the idea of democratic socialism. With this, in 1930, you also mentioned the Burmese days criticism of British colonialism in form of how George Orwell written in his essays in 1840s, and also how, as a young boy, how he went to the Oxford in 1918, and also in Animal Farm, the theoretical grounding of George Orwell on going to good college and with good scholarship, and how he's most interested in how he's get influenced from the BBC London's ranging speaker, high speaking from Asia's content, and based upon his experiences in Burmese days, Burmese he was serving under the colonial British imperialism. So he returned to the England in 1927. He has wrote that hostility to British imperial system. Based on this in 1930s and 1931, how economy began collapsing in Britain and England, and based on George Orwell was living in England at the time. He's examining the conditions and the contents of the Britain and downside of the story, how the Spain and Russia in 1937 with Soviet Hitler's media manipulations, how these things has massively influencing the democratic forms. And George Orwell came out with International Soviet Union and the concepts of international socialism, solidarity, brotherhood, and also sometimes George Orwell goes into the concepts of religion, God, and he also used to visit to the churches. He also formed in a totalitarian form. He himself examining the conditions of a British imperial system. Most of the time, his political and literary development and political views are based on imperialism. But or is from all these things, and he's going to solve when he going to solve the East, and again he came back to this downside. Most of the time, Orwell, when we see Orwell, he has expressed his view. Most of his views came in 1984, the democratic views, and in the form of 1984, where he is resolving himself around the liberty, freedom, and expressing the views of how democratic society can form. So thank you very much, Taylor Ji, for your thoughtful invocations Orwell on his anniversary today. With this, now I would like to invite Astik Misra to have a personal interaction, one-to-one a question with DJ Taylor Ji. Dear Astik, are you with me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. As DJ Taylor is with us, you can have interaction with DJ Taylor for one-to-one question. Now I request both of you, Astik and DJ Taylor, to have interaction.
David Taylor, sir, at the end, he mentioned about the threats which Orwell imposed with the 1984 and now the misuse of technology or something like Big Brother is watching you. Is it relevant now? So, and he was asking us to think upon this and ponder upon this. So, I am also in the same position, sir. Whether the kind of doubts Orwell raised through 1984, I am also in the middle of this that sometimes it feels very much relevant now that all those things are happening even now that the use of technology, especially from the what we can say, the kind of technology used by the government or the kind of technology used by anyone for all of us. It's kind of a threatening to everyone that whether we are using it in an appropriate manner or whether it has.
I'm having great difficulty in hearing you, Ashik.
Yes, me too.
I'm having trouble hearing you, I'm afraid.
Astik, use headphone.
Headphones?
आपका इको बहुत ज्यादा है आस्तिक आपका.
Echo आ रहा है. Astik, your voice is coming like echo on the side. Please use headphones.
Sir, is it okay now?
That's better. That's better. I think that's better. Do ask again. Ask again, Ashik.
Ask again.
You were asking about technology in 1984, weren't you?
Astik, they are asking you to repeat the question which you just raised. If you could just repeat the question to David.
Yes, ma'am. So, am I audible now?
Very much.
Yes, good.
Yes, very much.
Yes.
Okay.
That's good. That's good.
Thank you, sir. So, sir, at the end of the session, you just mentioned about the threats of the technology and the misuse of the power. So I was also in the same position when I was going through 1984. That whether it, even though it has written in 1949, still it feels so much relevant. And we are in a position that we can't say much that even though we are living in a democratic country or almost most of the part is in a democratic society, but still the questions which George Orwell raised through his novels are, I'm also in a position not to answer all those questions, that whether it is true to just to mention that the technology threats has ever gone, or is it still relevant now?
That's a very interesting question, Aztec. Thank you very much. I'm very interested in the way in which Orwell uses technology in 1984, because it's clear to me that although technology is the great instrument on which the authoritarian power in 1984 is predicated, it also seems clear to me that Orwell doesn't know very much about technology or how it works. So you have the telescreen, which is constantly surveying all the people in Oceania. And I'm thinking to myself, how does it work? Are there actual people watching every screen in every house? It's like the same thing happens when Julia and Winston go out into the countryside, and Julia keeps warning him to watch out for the hidden microphones. And you think, well, where are they hidden? Are they hanging in the air above people's heads? It's clear that Orwell hasn't actually thought out how the technology works. And in fact, when you think of the difference between his world of 1949 and ours here in 2022, it's clear that Orwell had barely kind of scratched the surface of how technological development was going to happen in the intervening 7 decades. And I suppose looking at it in the round and looking at it from the point of view of my own political opinions, I would suppose that certainly I think Orwell now would regard the whole sort of online Amazon, Facebook, Instagram culture that certainly we experience here in the West. I think that he would have regarded it as the crucial tool of late capitalism. Much more of a way of subduing people and keeping their minds in order than any kind of army or any kind of military power could do. I think Orwell would think that it was much more effective for being much more insidious. In other words, we don't realize, certainly in the West, we don't realize the power of things that we think are on our side, but which are actually grinding us down. Obviously, it is fatal. It is fatal to glibly to predict what Orwell would have said about something 72 years after his death. But that certainly would be the conclusion that I drew about the way in which technology informs the world here in 2022.
Yes. Sir, on a lighter note, can I ask that why did Orwell adopt the other name, sir? And he chose the George Orwell from Eric Arthur Blair.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you there, Ashtik.
Sir, sir, on a lighter note, I just want to know that why did Orwell adopt the other name?
I'm going to disappear and come back again. I think my technology is playing up.
Please be with us. Again, DJ will join with us.
Astik, in the meantime, can I ask a question for Michael?
Yes,
sure, ma'am.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Michael.
My name is Sean Michael, not just Michael.
Sean Michael. That reminds me of Sean Connery.
Yes, I went to the same school as Sean Connery.
Wow, that feels great. Okay. My question is, first of all, congratulations. It was a very interesting lecture. I belong to botany, but for a person now rooted in education, I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Astik, for inviting me. That's very kind. I wanted to ask that with reference to the emotion, with reference to the tone, when you illustrate in these illustrations, how much justice is the illustrator as well as the author as a team able to do with reference to the representation, because they haven't talked to the author, right? They are looking at the tone and tenor with reference to the written word. So how much of that justice, just like translation loss, right? How much of it do you think you're able to depict in this pictographical representation? How much justice, according to you?
Well, this is perhaps an impossible thing for anyone to decide in any situation. And Borges, the Argentinian writer Borges, talked about the process of translation, and some elements of that apply to adaptation as well, visual adaptation. And the thing is, to a certain degree, I don't really worry about it. So, for example, we did one of the books, these are my books behind, but is the Tao Te Ching, the Chinese classic Tao Te Ching. Now, this is such a complicated classic that your initial idea of thinking to adapt that would be just to say, well, it's impossible, I give up. But it seems to me that a key element of human creativity is a foolish forgetting about how difficult a thing is. Because if we were always thinking, if every band came along thinking we're never going to be as good as the Beatles, no band would ever make any music, right? So there has to be a certain kind of ignorance at the root of creativity, so to speak, in a way which seems odd, because normally the image of creativity is quite the opposite. But there has to be a certain kind of forgetting and ignorance. Otherwise, you'd be blinded by all the great things that people have done in the past. And that applies to the process of translation and adaptation as well, I think, to a certain extent. But on the other hand, it seems to me that certain of these things are basically universal human things that we can not despite cultures, but there are certainly universal things in terms of expressions and tone of voice and movements of our hand, which look aggressive or which look peaceful or something like this. So that your own humanity and your own behavior and your own psychology can be a guide for how you can do justice to what the person was imagining. And comic book writing is in a way a little bit like acting, or it's like acting and directing and writing all mixed together, because you have to think about what will people look like when they're being put upon, or what will people look like when they're thinking about something or visualizing something. And you have to both as a writer and as the artist have a kind of an actor's type way of processing these things. Like, for instance, we can very easily see this is laughter, but hidden inside Orwell's feeling is a distaste and a dislike for her, actually. And we can very clearly see that. So certainly these things, I think, are not all that difficult to convey, because we human beings have, we can understand those kind of emotions very clearly within ourselves and observe them in others. So it's a question of becoming observant as a writer and as an artist, and then in terms of the art, just developing the skill to visualize that, which is another element that I'm not really qualified to say much about. Okay.
That gives my answer. Thank you, Sean. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting, Sri Sean Littlesonji. And now I'd like to Astik and DJ Terry to
sir,
have interaction. Astik, you can, yeah.
Sir, I want to know that if you can, please tell us about the change in the Orwell's writing after the Spanish Civil War and the experiences of the Spanish Civil War. What happened after that?
The change in his writing after the Spanish Civil War, he almost immediately, I think, it's true to say becomes much more politically engaged. I mean, he says much later on in an essay in the early 1940s that it was after Spain that every word he wrote had been against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism. And it could be argued, of course, that a lot of the incidental essays that Orwell writes in the 1940s are not about this at all. You know, I mean, he writes essays about cups of tea, about how to make a cup of tea. He writes essays about going to old junk shops and buying bric-a-brac. He writes essays about all kinds of books and all kinds of obscure writers. But in a way, of course, that is political writing, because it is, it is, however quietly understated away, it is arguments for a kind of life and a kind of sensibility that a lot of totalitarian regimes would want to expunge, because they show individual human beings enjoying themselves and living lives that are beyond the controls of any interfering state or any sort of supernumerary presence. So I think it's perfectly true to say that even the 1940s, when Orwell writes an essay on how to make a nice cup of tea, boiling the water, putting the tea in properly, he is still, however unobtrusive a way, making a political point.
Sir, in one of your interview, I have read that you want to stick with Christopher Hitchens.
Sorry, I can't hear you, Ashtik. Can't hear. Voice has gone again.
I can hear actually, David. It might be on your side. I can hear Ashtik. Can you hear me, David?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sir, can you listen? This question is particularly to David, sir. That I want to know from him that he mentioned in an interview that he wants to stick with Christopher Hitchens. Yes, sir.
No, I think again he's having some problems. So there are certain questions.
I'm going to leave and come back again. I'm afraid I can't hear anybody, so I'm going to.
Ashtik, I can hear okay.
In the meantime, there are questions for Sean Michael.
Yes, sure.
There was one at the
question.
beginning there. Oh, sorry. Ashtik, yes, sorry. Someone has a who is it? Mark.
Now I would like to invite Suprabha to take a question and answer session. Suprabha?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Am I audible?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So we have quite a few questions in our chat section, and our participants want to know about few questions from the respective key speakers. So I'll be taking up the question. This question is for Sean Michael, sir. And the question is from Vidya Sagar Kumar. He says, how can humanitarian views are important for enhancing better learning opportunities in future? Any examples for dealing with student-teacher relation as well as learners' behaviors? I think he is asking it in the light of Orwell and his writings.
Well, this is, of course, a big problem. If we knew how to do this, or if we knew definitely clearly how to do it, we'd be doing it all over the world already. But of course, there's been lots of pedagogical research into the best way to teach and the best way to learn. But it seems to me that a key element which connects to the whole idea of democracy is, as I said, is that are we teaching people to think for themselves, have critical learning, critical thinking skills, critical learning skills, critical thinking skills, and the ability to analyze. And in this case, it means analyze everything from your own behavior to political systems. And so a type of education which is focused on that, I think, is the aim, except, and of course, almost everyone would say, yes, that's correct. But that's not what is actually happening in many parts of the world. And as I say, it's very much a problem in Japan, where I live. But I mean, if we just take a very specific example, Japanese students are very, very poor at asking questions. So it seems to me that an absolute basic element of developing critical thinking skills is to ask questions of yourself and others. So when I do classes here in Japan, rather than just talking all the time, I always say to my students, please ask me a question. And it's interesting and disappointing about how poor most students are at asking any kind of question. Sometimes they go etto, nan desu ka, and they can't even think of even a single question to ask. But so and that is an example of the kind of education system which Japan has now, which Orwell was complaining about. Of course, it's different cultures, and the time is 100 years later. But I think we can see a certain similarity there. But that's a very specific thing which I do. I always say to my students, please ask me a question. They ask me a question, right? Or they tell me something rather than just listening to me. That's a very easy and simple thing. But I think for young Japanese people, it's often their first opportunity to actually ask a teacher something. Okay.
Thank you so much, sir. Another question, this is also from Vidyasagar Kumar, and he asks this question to David. He asks how cultural differs about authoritarian society. Can we say social economy affects the society according to George Orwell?
That's a very interesting question as to how cultural differences may affect the kind of totalitarian societies that emerge. Orwell himself makes this point very interestingly with regard to fascism, which of course he was violently opposed to in the 1930s. And when his experience of serving in Spain, for example, in 1937, made him differentiate profoundly between the kind of authoritarianism that was being produced in Nazi Germany and between the system, the system that prevailed in Franco's Spain. And he said that, in fact, whereas Nazism was very sort of technocratic and forward-looking and had its own sort of warped version of progress, what Franco was trying to do in nationalist Spain in the 1930s was really, aided by the aristocracy and the Catholic Church, he was really trying to restore a kind of feudalism. So I think, as I say, that is a very good point, and we shouldn't simply assume that that forms of authoritarianism are not going to differ, that there is some kind of blanket nature of tyranny which always gets imposed. Although, of course, if we go back to the technological argument that Ashtik and I was discussing in one of the recent questions, there is this idea, I suppose, that the more technologically linked the world gets and the more that blanket of technology is sort of cast over the planet as a whole, then the more uniform and the more homogeneous that kind of life will be. So I suppose it's possible that we certainly reach a situation in which the kind of technological stimuli that people are reacting to are just the same in the east of the world as they are in the west, and so that there will be much more of a kind of uniformity, call and response. But I mean, these are, this is all sort of predicting centuries ahead and so forth. But it is very interesting, I think, how we all know that we can all observe from our own countries and our own political arrangements the way in which particular structures are kind of differentiated by the cultural characteristics of the nations involved. So it's perfectly possible that those kind of differences would apply. So thank you very much for that question.
Thank you so much, sir. There is another question from Amit Kumar. However, he has not mentioned who he wants to ask the question, so I'll be putting up the question. Any of you can answer. It's on which basis we distinguish the views of Orwell as democratic or non-democratic. Can you please illustrate it with any example through Orwell's examples or any context he has mentioned?
Sorry, I can't hear. Is that to me?
That was to both of us, David.
No, okay, right, fine, good. Sorry.
Let me start, please. Okay.
Sure, sir.
It partly depends on how we define democracy, and if we say that democracy is basically what we decide it is, because after all, the point of democracy is we govern ourselves. So, I mean, if that's the essence of it, then we can create various aspects of what democracy is, because we are deciding it ourselves. And so in terms of what Orwell has said, which is democratic or not democratic, it partly depends on what we consider to be positive or negative now. And David has mentioned that Orwell was very much influenced by his own upbringing and called himself a Tory anarchist, I think, in some... When did he say that, David? When did he call himself a Tory anarchist? Do you remember? Oh, we can't hear David again. David, we can't hear you. You can hear us, but we couldn't hear you. Oh.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I asked you, when did Orwell call himself a Tory anarchist?
Well, Orwell didn't call himself somebody. I think somebody else called him a Tory anarchist. But his wife,
called himself.
His first wife, Eileen, wrote a very interesting comment on The Lion and the Unicorn. You know, she wrote his call for sort of a socialist revolution, where she said that George has written a book which is about how to be a socialist though Tory. So I think she'd worked him out at a very early stage.
Well, I like the phrase Tory anarchist because it contains Peter Cook, as in Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, called himself a Tory anarchist as well. And it's a kind of a funny mixture of opposites, which in some ways does describe these kind of maverick figures. David already mentioned that Orwell was in various ways conservative. I mean, he loved gardening. What's more British or English gentleman than doing your garden and pruning your roses? So, as I said, it's what I said, David, when you were away, is that democracy is, in a way, what we define it, because the key element of democracy is that we're governing ourselves. And anarchism, of course, is based on the idea of governing yourselves without leaders. So it somewhat comes down to what we decide now is positive or not. For example, Orwell's ideas of Jewish people, or his terminology for Jewish peoples, which David has mentioned in his very good book, it is considered to be possibly anti-Semitic now, but certainly poorly phrased now. And so we would call that non-democratic, possibly now. But at the time, Orwell was surprised that anyone could think that he was saying something negative, or was surprised to hear that. So in 50 years or 100 years' time, presumably we'll still be talking about Orwell. We may have different views as to what is positive or negative about what he said. David, do you want to add something on to the... Did you hear what the question was, David?
Yes, I did. Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting point, and in fact, an inevitable and a kind of necessary development in the way in which we look at writers over time, and that we're always going to have different prisms through which to inspect them, and this shouldn't be a reason for alarm. One shouldn't necessarily think that a writer you like is going to be besmirched by this process. It's just a way of understanding new things about them, I think.
That's all for the questions. Thank you so much, both of you, for answering to our queries wonderfully. Over to Omkar, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite her former OTA, Dr. Manisha Rani, Assistant Professor, School of Education, Mahatma Gandhi University, Champaran. Dr. Manisha Rani, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. First of all, a very graceful good evening to all of you from India. So on behalf of School of Education, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, East Champaran, Bihar, on behalf of entire fraternity of this institution and on my own behalf, first of all, we would express our heartfelt thanks to Professor Sanjeev Kumar Sharma, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, East Champaran, Bihar, for always believing in us and providing us this kind of learning platforms. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your blessings. Now, moving forward, in absentia, we also extend our gratitude to Professor G. Gopal Reddy, Sir, Honorable Pro Vice Chancellor, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, East Champaran, Bihar, for always inspiring us to do such scholastic activities along with co-scholastic activities. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Now, we extend our special thanks and gratitude to Professor Ashish Srivastava, Head and Dean, School of Education, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, East Champaran, Bihar, for always encouraging us and all the scholars for organizing such educational events through which we can develop new insights and perspectives. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for giving us this kind of opportunities. Now, moving forward, in this connection, we extend our heartfelt gratitude and sincere thanks to our esteemed key speakers of today's international webinar, Mr. Sean Michael Wilson and Ms. which make this program interesting and meaningful. We are highly grateful and obliged to our key speakers for accepting our invitation. So, with the quote of George Orwell, that happiness can exist only in acceptance. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your deliberations and enlightening us. And indeed, reflection of this happiness is there among all of us. Proceeding ahead, now we extend our sincere thanks and gratitude to Mr. Quentin Kopp, Chair of the Orwell Society, for showing his keen interest in this program and being part of this program. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. So, in this series of vote of thanks, now we are extending our heartfelt thanks to the convener of the program, Dr. Mukesh Kumar, Associate Professor, School of Education, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, Bihar, and coordinators of the program, Dr. Rasmi Srivastava and Dr. Patlo Tomkar, Assistant Professor, School of Education, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, Bihar, for their continuous support and cooperation. Thank you so much. Now, we would like to thank the backbone of this program, Mr. Astik Kumar Mishra, for organizing such a great event. Thank you, Astik. And along with Astik, we would like to give thanks to organizing committee members, Ms. Suprabhade, Ms. Indubala, Mr. Angad Kumar Singh, Mr. Ganesh Kumar Sukla, Research Scholar, School of Education, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, Bihar, for their helping hand and contribution. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Now we extend our heartfelt thanks to our participants for their active and energetic participation. And we also express our sincere thanks to Professor Dhananjay Kumar, Dr. Sunita Yadav ma'am, Dr. Vaibhav sir for their presence and gracing this occasion. Thank you all. Now over to Omkar sir. Dr. Omkar sir.
Thank you. Thank you very. Yes, ma'am. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Now I would like to request each one of you, respected teachers, writers, dear scholars, students, can you please join your camera if those who are comfortable for a group photo. Ms. Indubala and Ganesh Shukla, Angad, Suprabha, you can take a group photo. Could you please show your cameras for a group photo? Can we have a group photo? Is my message coming? I request each one of you for switching on their cameras, those who are comfortable for group photo. Could you please switch on your cameras for group photo? Asif?
Sir, my camera is on.
Okay. Indubala and Suprabha and Angad Kumar
is done, I think.
Kindly take the group photos. Okay, thank you.
Done,
Now I
Dr.
would like
Done.
to request each one of
I
you.
would just like to say thank you to everyone, to Sean, to David, to Shalini ma'am, to Ashish, everyone. It's a pleasure for me.
We have national anthem. I request each one of you to stand for the national anthem. Mr. Sanjeev, could you please take up the national anthem? I request each one of you, to stand up for national anthem.
I'll stand as well.
Is it audible, sir? Sir.
Yes.
पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल गंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जनगण नायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sean Michael ji. Thank you, David Taylor ji.
Thank you.
Omkar ji, you can conclude now.
Thank you. I was standing as well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. With
Thank you.
Permission of the
Very enjoyable.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. Dhanwad to all.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Sri Sean Michael Wilson and Sri David.
Thank you.
DJ
I enjoyed it.
With
Very
all
interesting.
humility. Thank you very much.
कहा यार हम तो कुछ कह नहीं पावा.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Astik, congratulations. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
ये अंगद सर हम तो कुछ कह